complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Connor Tomlinson, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing?
Thank you very much for inviting me, my friend. I saw the prior conversations you had with my fellow Lotus Eaters, and so couldn't miss the opportunity when you popped a DM my way over X.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to it. One of the things I've been really impressed with at Lotus Eaters is just the absolute depth of talent there. You know, there are some sort of organizations, you know, you can fill in that for yourself, where they have sort of, you know, one star and then a bunch of just backbenchers, right, who are completely useless. And then Lotus Eaters, it's sort of like the further I go in, the more people I run across. It's like, oh, this is just a string of absolute top tier talent. And so I've been very, very excited to have you on. I think it'll be a good discussion.
Yeah, we're a real group of intelligent fellows over there. I mean, we have an open plan office. I'm not in there all that much these days, just because I spent about 18 months traveling for 5 hours of trains every day to be in office and record all the time. But since launching my new show, my independent show on a Wednesday afternoon, I don't have to be around the studio as much to film bits and pieces unless I'm on the podcast. But when I am in office, because there are no real dividers between us, there's just constant conversation flowing and constant disagreement because, you know, we still have, God bless them, some of my colleagues clinging to their liberal priors. We've got atheists and pagans and reluctant Christians and full-throated Zoomer reactionary Catholics. Hello. So there's always some locking of horns going on, which keeps things interesting.
I think that is, and this is sort of maybe an off topic from what I wanted to discuss, but there is some irony to the fact that perhaps the most truly liberal conversation is held on the illiberal right. People who don't really believe in that, you know, in the idea of the marketplace of ideas per se, probably have the most interesting discussions just by virtue of the fact that, you know, so much of society otherwise is locked down into this narrow box of certain discussable ideas. I mean, you see this very much in media. Right. But anyway, that's not actually what I brought you on to discuss. One of the things that recently caught my eye from the UK is a conversation that Richard Dawkins had, I believe, on LBC. And for those who aren't familiar, Richard Dawkins was, you know, one of the four horsemen of New Atheism, very vocally anti-Christian. And, you know, he was talking to the broadcaster, some woman whose name I do not remember, about the idea that he sees himself as a cultural Christian, you know, that he views the cozy old Church of England, you know, the nice vicar, as sort of a positive thing. And now he looks around his country, you know, where instead of church bells, it's, you know, a mosque minaret bringing out a call for prayer, and feels like there's something lost. And I think rightfully people in our camp looked at that and basically said, well, you got what you asked for, right? You know, you were instrumental in destroying that kind of cultural Christianity. And so I'll throw it back to you, but how much of a force was New Atheism in the UK? And do you view, you know, England as a sort of a post-Christian society, I guess?
It's hard not to when Buckingham Palace, our main cathedrals, our most famous high streets in London, and every single government account and the Archbishop of Canterbury are celebrating Eid and Ramadan. So it's not just a secular society; it's a post-Christian, rapidly Islamifying society. It's re-enchanting in a barbaric way, and I think sorry, I've done the thing that you did just off air, by the way, because I was about to say Christopher Hitchens, but we've got the re-interned Weekend at Bernie's corpse of New Atheism being puppeteered around through the mouth of Richard Dawkins here. But Richard Dawkins himself, not long ago, went on Piers Morgan's show after Salman Rushdie was stabbed, and flat out refused to talk about Islam because he thought it would be a physical threat to himself, and is now acknowledging, I suppose in a sort of friend-enemy existential way, the fact that the Christians were never really a problem for him. He spent all his time knocking down what he thought were fundamental truth claims using a rationalist scientific epistemology to demolish what was morally laden myth. Myth, I don't mean untrue, as in powerful story. And then has now turned around and wondered why his civilization didn't come to the same 130 IQ Anglo liberal secular enlightenment, a transvaluation of all values as Nietzsche recommended we do, and has instead gone the other way to where, per Nietzsche's prediction, that the great cathedrals of Europe and now the UK have become the mausoleums and sepulchres to a dead ideal. Like every single church is Philip Larkin's church going, where it's just empty and dilapidated and kind of sad to walk through and look at. And okay, well, nature abhors a vacuum, and now something much more brutal, something which doesn't share the sort of liberal-ish priors that liberalism parasitized from Christianity, has rushed in to fill the gap, and now cannot be negotiated with as well. This is something that I think he's recognizing in just shutting up about it. This is something that our political establishment doesn't recognize, though, because currently politics in England kind of works like a blender. You know the phrase melting pot you hear a lot in America, where they conceive it as some kind of crucible where every metal will be stuck in the same container, will be melted down, all the impurities come off of it. Well, in a piece I made about the recent protests on Israel, Hamas, Palestine, etc., that we see playing out every weekend and Wednesday in Westminster for the last 6 or 7 months, I said that multiculturalism is functioning like a blender because all of these incompatible ingredients have been packed in the parameters of secular materialistic liberalism by our post-Christian politicians, and you've hit blend, and then they tell you that this thing is really good for you, this thing to drink, but then it's got really bitter aftertaste because the strongest element in there, the least liberal element in there, that doesn't share the same precepts as all the other elements, is going to be the most overpowering, and that's Islam. Or in some sectors it's wokeism, even though wokeism is an outgrowth of liberalism. So no wonder Dawkins is feeling very insecure, because he has set the stage for this complete and utter capture of every single institution by either sort of like woke liberal subjectivism accelerated by the power of technology that he championed, or the barbarism of second reflection that is falling into a kind of third world Islamism that's been important here.
Well, and I think that it's an interesting example because it's something that we've seen, many times over the last, well, I guess really the last 9 years since the Great Awakening, which is effectively we see these sort of standard bearers of kind of post Cold War rationalist liberalism, right? Many of the IDW types fall into this category, who were completely fine with the Cultural Revolution up to a certain time, who were just completely horrified by the logical conclusion of their own argument. And the example I always remember, and I sort of, view this as the moment I stopped being part of, or really listening to anyone in the IDW sphere, was I was at the gym, working out, listening to a podcast, and I was listening to, I believe it was Brett and Heather Weinstein, and this was during, one of the big abortion debates in the U.S., and she had just finished up talking about, why we needed to. Why we ought to have, social responsibility to other people. And then without, necessarily realizing it, pivoted to abortion and basically said every woman has the right to abortion, right? Every woman has the right to sort of terminate her biological responsibility. And that was such a disconnect that actually physically stopped. I was like, wait a minute, you haven't thought this through, right? There's no connection there. And, much like, Christopher Hitchens or certainly we can find other figures as well. It is this very kind of presentist view where, this sort of, woke mind virus, whatever, this Islamism of society, well, that is a new thing, right? Which is from a certain perspective true. And so if we just go back upstream, 10, 15, 20 years to a version of this that I was comfortable with, right? Like we see that Richard Dawkins, the type of Christianity he's referring to is sort of a toothless Christianity that no one really believes in. Right. It's the, the harmless vicar, the church full of old people, where no one really, views their faith as having sort of like a political consequence. And I think that that's an interesting example, right? Because in each you see this desire to, return to something that they are necessarily comfortable with, but not something that would actually be able to sort of confidently resist the forces of either outside invasion or internal ideological subversion.
Yeah, they want something inoffensive that doesn't assert a normative moral framework that reminds them that their own consciences are screaming at them. The perfect example of this is Peter Boghossian this morning. This is the 16th of April, time of recording. And Boghossian was tweeting yesterday about a Spanish politician who has been caught eating excrement on some sort of adult website. And he was saying, unpopular opinion, but we should leave him alone to the privacy of his own bedroom. It's like, and then as soon as people were going, sorry, if your version of liberalism is defending people that eat excrement, then you might turn around and find yourself completely alone, except for the people that are using this ideology to knock down all social taboos so that they can just eat excrement. Because everyone else normal is just going to go, yeah, I don't really want to advance that position, thank you, as my civilization deteriorates around me. And then his response was, wow, lots of authoritarians here and lots of Christians who seem afraid of judgment somehow, even though Christianity calls us to judge people. I mean, what seems to have happened here is the same sort of thing that was advanced by John Stuart Mill. Patrick Deneen writes really well about this in Why Liberalism Fails, and it's that there has been a form of social liberalism that has been advanced by the chattering classes as a kind of elite ideology for two reasons. One, to evade their own consciences from consuming vices because they were, I don't know, sexual deviants or creeps or the sort of French philosophers that wanted to lower the age of consent. Or, in Mill's liberalism, it was to demolish all of the social expectations that they thought lay like a dead hand upon them, to liberate the people that they thought would be exceptional individuals so that they could experiment and innovate, and all the rest of the people that just follow incentives could flourish beneath them, the sort of Randian great man theory. Side note, Rand actually based that Superman great man idea on a serial killer, it turns out, so probably not the best role model there. But what's happened there is it's kind of become a luxury belief, because even though the people that thought presumptively, okay, we'll arrive at the end of history, it just will do a rising tide raises all ships thing with all of the people that are capable of self-generating ideas and can follow along a kind of cultural Christianity and rationalize their way into a universal ethic without needing a metaphysics, and they can just upgrade material conditions and everyone will be happy and we'll all sing John Lennon's Imagine. That's a sort of luxury belief, because what they don't realize is that people needed a cultural safety net because they will just fall and be caught by it. And if they slash that cultural safety net, well, they'll just either keep falling into deaths of despair, suicide being a leading cause of death for men under 50s, drug overdoses and porn consumption, and drinking is going up, for example, particularly among the boomer and Gen X generation. Or they're going to fall prey to other ideological persuasions, either the algorithmically driven gender and race grievances that we see from wokeness and the Great Awakening, or because of demographic change, and also because a lot of aggrieved young men are consuming male vitalist content, which seems to have actually been a kind of Motte and Bailey for Islamic polygamy. Lots of them are going to convert or just double down on their existing Islamism, which don't share the liberal priors and therefore aren't open to persuasion. And so if Dawkins is turning around going, well, you know, I basically demolished all the religious monuments, rhetorically, like an ISIS convert, and suddenly people haven't just left the statue plinths empty. Instead, they've reconstructed the idols in the shape of their antagonistic, stronger gods. Oh, golly, how did we get here? It's like, well, you, Richard, actually, it's your fault.
Well, right, and this is something I was talking to one of my best friends about, which is there's sort of a good value check for any sort of social system. I won't say ideology because I don't believe in ideology per se. And that is effectively, you know, is this something that you can iterate more than one time, right? Does this work? Can you pass this on from generation to generation? Can it work for, you know, multiple, you know, segments of the social strata? And I think that what we see in that sort of, you know, atomized, you know, liberalism is no. You know, not only does that system not reproduce, and you cannot motivate people to have children, or, you know, if they have children, to appropriately care for them. You see this in sort of the way baby boomers got divorced, you know, the way that they sort of produced latchkey kids in Generation X. But also, right, we see this in the fact that, you know, those sort of luxury beliefs that, you know, if you're at Harvard, you know, you can sleep around a bit and maybe do some coke in college, and we can look at the data and see that, you know, you'll probably settle down by the time you're in your 30s, and it's not okay for you, but it's not going to ruin your life, so to speak. But someone, you know, lower down the social ladder, who doesn't have that same type of, you know, IQ or same type of, you know, self-control, certainly cannot. You know, that infamous essay, Luxury Beliefs, you know, he mentions, you know, setting your Tinder radius at Harvard's campus. And if it's 1 or 2 miles, right, you see polyamorous people who are, you know, third-year gender studies students at Harvard, who, even if they're not good people per se, are probably not going to, you know, end up homeless. But if you set that search radius to 25 miles, you know, outside of that beautiful little college town into rural Massachusetts, you know, you see these overweight, tattooed, you know, single mothers of four who are also polyamorous, right? They've adopted that same luxury belief, but it does not suit, or it's not usable at multiple kind of stations in life. And I think it's interesting when we take the definition of the left as primarily anti-hierarchy or egalitarian, is that, you know, there's sort of this buried desire in that to apply, you know, apply the rules of the upper class to everyone, right? To grant privilege universally. And, you know, sort of the idea with that is, oh, if we grant everyone the privileges of, you know, the upper 1%, they will be the same type of person. You know, we will have a whole nation of, you know, wise aristocrats. And I think what we've seen is, you know, instead of equality raising people up, if anything, it brings everyone down. And we're sort of this like Jean Bergerac kind of like nightmare society, you know, where we look at our elites and they're dramatically worse off than they were, you know, 50, 70, 100 years ago. And I think that, you know, that's sort of an interesting refutation of equality. And look, you and I are both Generation Z. We're both very young. And one of the things I think is interesting among people our age is that there are very, very few Generation Z liberals, right? On either side, the left or right. You know, effectively, all of us are political extremists of one variety or another. And I think part of that is effectively that we've sort of seen liberalism with its makeup off. You know, that this has really never worked in our time. And, you know, I think that, you know, regardless of this kind of like retarded, you know, socialist left or somewhat alarming, you know, masculine vitalists or, you know, whatever our group of guys is, you know, and there are more camps than that. It does seem that, you know, liberalism has sort of self-refuted, and it seems like no one left or right believes in it anymore. You know, much like the Church of England, I hate to say.
Yeah, the bow of the boomer truth paradigm is breaking. I wrote about this recently in the European Conservative. I think it's no coincidence that it's breaking on the analogies of the Second World and Cold War being stretched to the ongoing conflicts in Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Gaza, because the analogies just don't apply anymore. There are different technological and political conditions. All of the institutions that have been set up since the First and Second World Wars to keep the peace, be it the League of Nations and the UN or the European Court of Human Rights, to various extent, the encompassing of China in the World Trade Organization following the Cold War, all of these decisions just haven't panned out because, again, liberalism in its sort of golden arches arrogance, thinking that adequately managed increases in material conditions could ameliorate all cultural conflicts, is just incorrect. It's the Schmittian friend enemy has returned to politics, and I think that Gen Z in various ways recognizing the blank slate is a myth and it's a false anthropology, in recognizing human difference, in recognizing the nature of politics as an existential battle, is more extreme, quote unquote, but a lot more honest. And it's actually a less stifling political climate to fight in. This is why in the recent trigonometry episode I did, I just said, look, there's going to be a political paradigm shift. There's going to be some kind of revolution. I don't mean there's going to be a Bolshevik or French Revolution where people are rioting in the streets and bringing out the guillotines. But there is going to be a complete collapse of the boomer way of doing things. There will be a total overhaul and reassessment of whether or not these international institutions and the social welfare programs are working for us. And it is also going to be an intergenerational project. And this is why I think, not just because the savviness of the Long March this time around, the people conducting it will be the sort of reactionary types, but also because the reactionary types are just having way more kids. I think we'll win out. So I have a little bit of faith in the long term. In the short term, it's going to be brutal and kind of painful, and there's going to be a lot of people who have been fed a steady diet of grievance politics through algorithms because they're not latchkey kids. I've been raised by screen kids. So like negligent parenting is just going to lead to a bunch of resentful revolutionaries. I think in the next couple of decades, it's going to be pretty brutal. We're going to see a lot of spiteful mutants try and influence politics. But give it sort of like 50 years or something after the collapse of the boomer world order, I think I entrust the people who have our kind of sentiments to rebuild in that way. And I also say our kind of sentiments it's important here when you say like our camp. I want to disentangle a little bit of that because there is some connective tissue between sort of Christians, Catholics, Catholic reactionaries, Christian nationalists, which isn't a thing in the UK because Christian nationalism is a very American phenomenon, and the return with a V, Greco-Roman pagan vitalism, just on pure aesthetics. You know, there's a call to hierarchy, there's a call to excellence and courage and Homeric virtues there, and there's a bit of intermingling between the two, even if they don't share fundamental metaphysics. They actually share a conception of metaphysics. There's something that liberalism lacks. It tries to marginalize all conversations about comprehensive doctrines of the good or metaphysics to the private sphere, as Reno and Schmidt and Hazoni and all these good writers have written about. But those guys at least share some precepts of metaphysics. The other wing of the vitalists, which I actually think will die out as well, and I keep getting flack for this, but I don't care, I'll say it, is the sort of inheritors of the red pill who have styled themselves after the red pill. So not necessarily the guys that are talking for men's rights in divorce courts and the dismantling of family courts, not like Jeff Younger or AA's friend Red Hawk, for example. I'm talking about guys like Myron Gaines from Fresh and Fit, Andrew Tate, Pearl Davis, the guys that run the Whatever podcast, who advocate for hedonism and play Mott and Bailey with Islamic polygamy because they say, all Western women are done for, don't get married because the divorce courts are rigged, but also have a harem full of women and also shag about. And it's like, there's very few guys that are actually going to get to exploit that. Instead, a large portion of that audience will be guys that won't be reproducing and also aren't as directed and interested in political change and personal virtue. And so I think that sort of part of the quote-unquote right that have grafted themselves onto us will wither and die off at some point. And so we'll have a sort of more forward-looking, more competent, more cohesive thing to go forward with and sort of rebuild, especially after the boomer paradigm dies at the next couple of elections.
I think that, you know, I share your general prognosis. You know, I think that the next couple decades are grim, but the long-term timeline is, I view, relatively rosy. And I think part of it, right, is that, you know, when we were talking about this before we went live about the kind of core premise of liberalism as being sort of a rejection of the idea that, you know, metaphysics, these broader ideas ought to be discussed or invoked in the public square. And so you can sort of coast in that situation if everyone largely agrees on everything, right? Britain was a homogenous society. You know, America was if not homogenous, a overwhelmingly, you know, European Protestant nation. And so regardless of your opinion on either one of those societies, everyone was on roughly the same page. You know, in the American context, you see this because other groups, when they moved here, Catholics or Jews, started their own schools, because even though there was no official state religion, Protestant ethic, you know, prayer, all of these things were practiced in school. And so they said, well, you know what, you know, this is not my religion, I'll start something else. So you can sort of see that in negative. And, you know, when you've taken those things explicitly out of the social consciousness, you can coast on the fumes on an implicit basis. But in the background, you know, people are diverging, new people are being brought in. And so you're in a situation where no one agrees on priors whatsoever. And so, you know, you mentioned that you were, you know, reading The Return of the Strong Gods. And I think that's the thesis there. But one of the things I think is sort of interesting in this, right, is that it seems to me that the bet that our elites are making is essentially this. You know, our culture, the elites, does not reproduce. You know, I have a friend who's multi-generational. I think he's 6th generation Harvard. He has a great deal of kids, but the average TFR in his graduating class, and he's in his 50s, right? So you can do the math there, is 0.6. No one at that level is reproducing. And so I think that effectively the reason you see so many, you know, middle class and upper class white women fawning over refugees, right, fawning over migrants, is effectively they are using migration to correct their population imbalance, right? Oh, we will bring these people in to outbreed the chuds. You know, one of it is economic, right, to keep the social security pyramid, which Dan and I discussed, you know, going. But also it's to basically keep those people in power, because these new arrivals are wow, I said a stroke there. These new arrivals are clients of power, right? They're clients of the state. And so, you know, when you talk about this idea of, you know, breeding them out, that's true. We actually see that in America, right? The Amish, for instance, who are sort of a bizarre, Anabaptist separatist movement. I think you actually have some of them in the UK, just a very small number. But they reproduce at a dramatic rate. There'll be a very noticeable part of the population in 20, 30 years. And if we were sort of a sealed system, that would be a dramatic transformation. But when you import 12 million people in 3 years, that offsets that, no matter what. But one of the things I think is interesting, and you've seen this in Canada, you saw this during the Trump years in the US, is that when conditions get uncomfortable, right? When Canada becomes dramatically overcrowded, when you have a slightly mean politician in office, people essentially self-deport, they leave. And I think that, when we see that transformation of the kind of founding stock of a nation where progressives are not reproducing, more conservative reactionaries are, you're self-selecting for a population of people who have quite a lot of attachment to their country. And this other population, no matter how numerous, who is there for Gibbs. And when the Gibbs dry up, right, who stays? This group of people who do have a connection to the culture, who do have a connection to the nation, or the people who are basically just there to get free stuff. And so to me, that's one of the points that I sort of bring up in the whole demographics is destiny debate, which is one, we've seen these populations decide to leave when conditions get marginally uncomfortable. And when that happens, who are we left with, right? Who is the remnant? And it seems to me that, really the only way progressives reproduce now is sort of as a parasite, right? By siphoning off, favored sons from the Midwest, so to speak, who get to, who get into the Ivy Leagues, or, by kind of airdropping propaganda via TikTok. But anyway, I realized I've been going for probably 5 minutes now, but nonetheless, I think that that's an interesting dynamic sort of playing out behind the broader conversation about demographics.
Yeah, there's loads in there that I want to pick up on. I mean, you're exactly right on the fact that progressivism doesn't reproduce, it recruits. And this is what Wendell Berry was talking about with strip mining, or Nick Land with the IQ shredder. They set up these urban progressive epicenters of economic and educational opportunities, and they draw in all of the otherwise intelligent pillars of the community into these places. They delocalize them from their parents around whom it's actually far easier to bring up offspring. So that's something that discourages them. They increase the price of housing and rob them of their savings. So they're unable to put down roots permanently in the city. They're constantly paying the pensions and mortgages of the boomer gentocracy who have purchased property and let it out forever. And then they might return to their hometown with no more wealth than their parents or when they started in their early 20s. And so you've created this sort of Peter Pan generation who don't have children and who have infinite disposable income for transitory goods, but nothing to buy spades and seeds to plant those trees under which their sons and daughters will rest in the shade, if that makes sense. In terms of the demographics point, I mean, there's lots there that I can go into. In the UK, currently, we're wedded to this inverse demographic pyramid where UK women have a birth rate of below 1.5 children per woman. We've reached, for the first time in history, 50.2% of women over 30 have reached the age 30 and have no children and are not married. And 50% of those, according to Stephen Shaw's data in his documentary Birth Gap, 50% of those women will never have children. I think it's something like currently 25% of all Gen Z women are projected not to have children, which is staggering. And so what the politicians are doing is going, all right, well, we're sub-replacement birth rate. We don't have enough workers in the immediate. We work on a 4-year election cycle. And rather than invest in innovation and automation, rather than have a scaled down economy which considers things like GDP per capita and family ties and replacement birth rates as net goods. No, we need annual GDP increases to keep competitive with the other G7 and G20 nations, and therefore infinite Africans just to increase the population, never mind stagnating productivity, just so it looks like the money's going up. Also, we factor in state spending into our GDP. So the more Africans we battery farm in hotels that are subsidized by the government, the more GDP goes up. It's a really perverse Ponzi scheme. And they completely neglect the fact that there are cultural incompatibilities being brought in, because in their presumptive arrogance of liberalism, they think that, again, adequately managed material conditions can ameliorate all of these value conflicts. In 2015, Angela Merkel said something, it was akin to, if we failed Europe on the refugee question, we won't create the kind of Europe we imagine. And it's like, right, okay, so we're all suffering for your utopian delusion. And said utopian delusion, and this goes right back to your sort of point about Protestantism, and also Judaism as well. There are two predominant groups that sort of bought into the boomer truth paradigm. And by boomer truth paradigm, I mean the complete terror following the Second World War, that if a nation acts in the interests of its particular peoples, cultures, or landmasses' interests, then they're going to become Adolf Hitler, even if they fought to defeat the Nazis. And this was advanced by all sorts, Leo Strauss and Friedrich Hayek in Road to Serfdom, who then influenced Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, and even now dissident former Prime Minister Liz Truss was a major Hayekian. We labour under this sort of mindset that freedom is the unmitigated good, that the entire purpose of government is to sort of undo itself and return us to a kind of liberal state of nature where we're maximally free and maximally equal, and use technological means to sever our cultural bonds, our economic bonds, our relationships, and mutual obligations to one another. And so the state has an interest in every single human interaction at this point to ensure you're free and equal. And it infers from any kind of disparity, because fundamentally under the blank slate, we all started as equal, that if there is a disparity, there must have been discrimination. Therefore, the state steps in to ameliorate the discrimination. Because the Nazis recognized difference, and obviously did some other terrible bad things, anyone that also recognizes difference between cultures and peoples and acts in their own particular interest is immediately decried as Adolf Hitler, because even though it's implacable. And so we have to insist on the blank slate being real. And therefore the state must unmoor us from one another and return us to a state of freedom and equality. And therefore, bound up with the demographic issue is the immigration issue, in which the state now exists to spread the light of end of history liberalism to everywhere it could possibly touch. And so if it can't upgrade the third world fast enough, it just brings the third world into its parameters and again hopes that all the cultural conflicts are disentangled. And it insists on making religion of anti-racism, because otherwise to recognize difference would be to be like Adolf Hitler. And so all of our public policies is kind of laboring under the construction of a liberal utopia, which is basically impossible and will never actually work. But otherwise, everyone gets called racist. And because they'll be out in 4 years anyway, and they'll probably have a cushy job at the UN, they're just going to keep destroying their own countries and then pull the golden parachute. You know, this is why people are getting so disenfranchised with politics in the UK, because we can't own a home, we can't have a family, and there's nobody to bloody vote for, because everyone's too much of a coward. Otherwise, they'll be called the scary German man from the 1930s.
I just want to say you were the only Brit I've ever heard reference Wendell Berry. So you win points for that. Yeah, I think that, and really this is, when we speak about feminization, right? You know, you hear that term and it means many things to many people. And you know, you sort of spoken harshly about the manosphere, and I agree with you there, right? Those are, I don't really enjoy that sphere, enjoy that conversation, to put it mildly. But I think that one of the things that, you know, is going to have to happen, right, in order to fix this problem is, one, someone is going to basically have to stand up and cut through the Gordian knot, right? To basically say, like, no, you know, like, this needs to be done. You know, I am going to sort of take charge here, right? And you see that, and it's interesting, you know, you bring up Land, because to me it very much reminds me of both what Land and Moldbug have said about formalism, right? That the current structure of government basically allows for unlimited deferral of responsibility. You know, it is very difficult to say who really did anything. And so again, right, when we have this sort of like feminized conception of, you know, conflict avoidance, very consensus based, and no one is really responsible. You know, when we have these sort of intractable issues, everyone sort of longs for a sovereign, right? Someone who sort of draws their sword, cuts through the Gordian knot, solves the problem, and with that accepts responsibility, both positive and negative. And I think it's why you see this sort of mass positive reaction to men like Bukele, right? Who basically said, like, all right, crime is illegal, you know, no more. And obviously that doesn't solve all the problems of a place like El Salvador, but it solves that one. You know, and I think that one of the sort of the rhetorical devices that you know is often used against people like us from more regime figures is basically, well, we can't solve this issue within our current paradigm. Therefore, this issue is unsolvable and we just have to manage it, right? We're just sort of like ameliorating the damage. And, I think that when we look at things, like, demographics, immigration, any one of these, and it feels very hopeless from a certain perspective. But that is only true if you sort of accept the premise that this is an eternal issue that can never be solved. And in order to solve that, you effectively, one, have to accept the responsibility for things that come from it, but also realize that your enemies might call you a mean name once or twice. And I think that one of the things that really separates, certain parts of our thing, the right wing, from previous instantiations, is a sort of denial of the moral legitimacy of the progressive state religion, right? Like, no, we don't need to fillet Martin Luther King. We don't need to say, like, oh, well, this had good intentions. We can say it's wrong, it's bad, get rid of it. And, like you said, I still think that the next couple years look rather rough. There's sort of this idea of, the vengeful son as an archetype, right? And I think that we've sort of gone from, the oppressive, smothering mother of the therapeutic state, and that is creating vengeful sons, right? Like incels are sort of one example. There's any number of others. But I think that, what comes next will not be bound by the same moral constraints for positive or for ill.
Yeah, just by virtue of us aging out of the boomer truth paradigm, you're going to get a cohort of Zoomer reactionaries who are less afraid of decisive political action taken by a sovereign in their interest, because they're not laboring under the sort of spectre of Hayek that says any form of collective action, any form of state action, any form of what Popper would have called statism, is bad because it will lead ineluctably to narcissism. And this is, like, when you're faced with the fact that the sort of little factoid that Philip Pilkington and Paul Morland found in their ARC paper, that if we continue along demographic trends, then the UK will be 54% first-generation immigrant by 2083, then pretty much any solution will be on the table at this point if the political establishment continues to disregard the democratic consent that they say they so believe in. If they continue to ignore, campaign against, and then try to overturn Brexit, if they continue to gaslight the public and say that we're going to reduce migration while causing record increases in migration, if they say they're going to stop the boats and deport them elsewhere while rubber stamping visas, with the only limitation being the sheer size of the Home Office and the amount of ink on the stamps at this point, you're going to get to the place where now, there was an Onward paper in 2022, The Kids Aren't All Right, that said around 50 to 60% of Gen Z were happy with a strongman who could ignore the will of Parliament to get things done, or just putting the army in charge. There was also, I would say just Gen Z, it was 18 to 35, so it's some millennials as well. There was also a cohort that said that they were happy with, like, governance by the experts. And I think that's the sort of, we still presume institutions are neutral level liberals who will probably be clamoring for the AI overlord, because under liberalism, the problem is the human being, not the eternal moral laws that never seem to fit human ends, that they've just constructed via rational thought experiment. So again, you're going to see a bifurcation. The children of the algorithm are going to gravitate towards the AI overlord. The other, I think, more intelligent, self-replicating, having kids, invested in their civilization, their community, their tribe, their congregation, their nation, Zoomers will go, okay, look, if a Bukele figure comes along, I'm voting for him. And this is what you saw in El Salvador, right? The people were driven to such desperation, they voted for a man who used to be a self-proclaimed leftist, and since converted to Catholicism by all apparent seems, and then has put 2% of the adult population in prison just by the fact that they have satanic face tattoos, made it one of the safest countries in Latin America, and is now standing on the balcony of his neoclassical palace after having a 92% approval rating and an 83% popular vote, saying, I did this all for you, alongside his wife and children. It's like, yeah, that's exactly what we all want. That is both the vibe and the aesthetic, but also the practical way of reasserting our national interest of making a peaceful and prosperous society in favor of the law-abiding populace, and rather than in favor of the imported, dependent, criminal clientele class, 47% of which are on social housing at my expense in London. If you keep driving people via anarcho-tyranny and via paying foreigners for infinite votes, who are the only ones that can afford to have kids, people are going to get pretty desperate and accept pretty much any solution offered to them, irregardless of if this violates the paradigm of boomer truth.
And I think that is it's sort of an interesting thing, because in the US, our sort of center-right compromise, really, and I want to say post-Civil Rights Act, you could probably define it more narrowly, has couched everything in, pure constitution worship, right? Like, oh, this sort of, divinely inspired document, using heavy scare quotes around that, right? If we could just, stick to that would solve all our problems. And any solution to current social ills that violates the spirit or the letter of that document, well, that would be worse. We can't become like them. And I mentioned that phrase when we were talking about this, that Gen Z is sort of seeing liberalism with its makeup off. And I think that is the exact same reason that, people are largely okay with, violating liberal morality to get out of this kind of social suicide pact. When I think of my political experience, what I remember as far as early events, it's really the end of the Bush era, the early Obama era. And it's things like, Barack Obama using the IRS to go after conservative organizations for tax fraud, right? Deliberately trying to do that. Him basically stirring up racial hatred, saying, Trayvon could have been my son, of him, referring to a large part of his constituency as, bitter hangers-on clinging to their God and their guns. And I think when you've seen that a certain number of times, you've seen that the opposition clearly has no respect for the rules of the game as laid out, clearly does not have the same ultimate desires as you do, right? They view this kind of like ultimate liberation of, breaking down all kind of social taboos around sex, around gender, around, even directly in the case of the Iowa State Senate, right? Satan himself, all of these things as a social good. And when, as many older people do, you look at that level of, evil and basically say, well, we can't be mean to them. We can't be harsh. We can't be, confident in our assertions. We have to sort of couch it all and view this as a good faith discussion between two, relatively equal parties. I mean, it's very clear that narrative doesn't hold water, right? That narrative has no moral content to it. It's clear that no one believes in it, really. You have some residual people for whom that was true when they were kids, maybe, people who are now in their 70s. But that is a completely fake and gay worldview. And I mean, look, there's a reason, right, that these sort of, mainstream conservative figures are massively getting BTFO'd by their rightward edge, right? The fact that I had Jeremy Carl from the Claremont Institute, right, and he's writing about anti-white hatred. Nothing against him, but I'm saying, like, look, like that would not be something the Claremont Institute put out 10, 15 years ago, right? And they're one of the good ones, And so I think that, we're seeing a transformation in that. And, one of the things about kind of our current regime that I want to address, because I think this is related, is that the fact that, one, no one really believes in it anymore, which I think is really important. So you see this in the American context with Joe Biden's kind of unofficial campaign slogan of, fighting for the soul of America. And one, turns out, America does have a real identity, sort of Schrodinger's identity, right? America is a propositional nation when we need to import, 12 million miscellaneous brown people. But, then it's just a sort of proposition, anyone can become anything. But when it's time to gin up voters, then America has a specific identity of, tolerance and peace and all that. But I mean, that's bullshit, right? No one actually believes in the soul of America in that context. And you see this in the fact that, one, the kind of hysteria around capital D democracy. But in your context, your politics, right? It's been interesting to watch Rishi Sunak, right? The kind of spineless suit, the man with absolutely no beliefs whatsoever, who speaks of everything in the most managerial tone. He referred to people who use AI language models to make pornography, right? Which is not a good thing. as vile degenerates, which, one, this might be the only time ever I actually agree with Rishi Sunak. But it's interesting to finally see, or in the very few situations in which our leaders pull out strong moral language, because just like Dawkins, right, they have so thoroughly undermined the basis for that morality, and they want to turn around and, when it is convenient to them, snap their fingers and act like, you know, we have this shared common strong morality. And to me, it's interesting to see that fall flat. So sorry, Connor, I've been going for a long time. I want to throw that back to you.
It's your show, my friend. Please don't apologize for anything. I want to remind everyone, as I do in most of my segments these days, that everything being done is a choice. It's not like, I mean, earlier you said about Yavin and how our system is set up to allow for an indefinite deferral of responsibility. And that's true, but if anyone hasn't seen the film Brazil, I mean, I didn't really enjoy it, but it is a good satire of how bureaucracy works. The people that are in bureaucratic institutions whose entire job is to just fill out a form to then be sent to the next person so that the form can keep being filled out and photocopied are very neurotic and very insecure. And so they set up the system so that they don't have to take decisions. But then the decision to make the system that way is itself a decision. It's like how neutrality is not neutral. If you presume to be neutral and presume that you are permissive of many lifestyles and you want to marginalize all concepts of the good to the private sphere, then what that usually plays out as is allowing a statue of Baal or Baphomet in a state capital, or appointing a dubiously gendered nuclear expert who steals women's luggage. You know, it always just so happens to cut on the side of weird satanic subjectivist hedonism, which is why, you know, when you say that you don't believe Joe Biden's fighting for the soul of America, I do. I think he's fighting to suck the soul out of it like a dementor or something, because that's the only way that his corpse can be reanimated. He's like Shang Tsung. But in speaking of strangely foreign named despots, I mean, Rishi Sunak, so there's a couple of things at play there. First of all, I know that there are a couple of sort of reactionaries embedded within the Downing Street apparatus, or at least they were. I think one of them's left. So I wouldn't be shocked if they actually authored that tweet for once and managed to wrestle the password off of whichever CCHQ intern keeps putting out those really dreadful infographics that they've since had to delete because they're really embarrassing. But the reason he's using such compelling moral language for the deepfakes, I wish it was as based as we hoped, but it's not. So what we've had recently is a campaign conducted about violence against women and girls. And it's been mainly around institutional police corruption because of Sarah Everard and misogyny online because of Andrew Tate. It's not been around the institutional rape of white girls by imported Pakistani Muslim immigrants that's been covered up by local councils because, again, they were afraid of being called racist. See Boomer Truth blank slatism. It's not about necessarily the porn industry, which has been given carte blanche to make young men addicted and deprive them of relationships and parasitize the fact that their fathers have been taken from their homes and they've been raised on smartphones instead. And it's made them impotent to the point of where 4 million of them have now been prescribed ED medication in the UK, which is outpacing elderly people as the leading body for prescriptions, which is mass medicating young men. It's none of those reasons. It's because we've violated our intersectional grievance constituency, and therefore we must act on behalf of feminist pariahs, because that's right, we're conservatives. So just as in the US, a lot of the time the regime is Republican in name only, and as I've seen recently, and I'm going to get in trouble here, I don't have particularly strong views on Israel Palestine either way, just other than I don't want to be paying for the stormtroopers v the sand people fight in the desert. You know, call me a lowly moisture farmer or something. But I see that Republicans, if they're not voting for Ukraine funding, they're really suddenly passionate about Israeli funding. And it's like, well, America first means America first, and also the socially acceptable ally in the foreign policy sphere that we always have to support. You know, so I don't blame a lot of American conservatives getting really disaffected about the fact that they feel that they have no representation. Over in the UK, we have absolutely no representation, and that's why the predominant meme ahead of the next election, which I think hasn't had a concrete date yet set, but everyone thinks it's going to be November, is 0 seats. It's like, I know a couple of Tory politicians. I know a couple who are sympathetic to what I say. I know at least one watches my show regularly, and I would like for at least one of them to keep their seat, but the likelihood is they're going to lose it. And so the meme has been 0 seats because you need a complete desolation of the current boomer paradigm of the current political system, of the existing parties which only exist to body block the actual right wing from getting power before we come in and shake things up and change things. So I wouldn't read too much into Rishi Sunak using a fun word that we like to use to pillory our enemies, because he is just sort of acting on behalf of the shit libs here.
Well, right. And my point in, excuse me, my point in that was not to say, Rishi Sunak is great, far from it, but it's to say, you can glean a lot from, when these people who are ordinarily, speak only in these kind of like sanitized tones, when they actually bring out strong moral language, right? And it's never for, the things you expect. You've seen this in the kind of shambling corpse of Joe Biden, right? That as he sort of becomes more and more demented, right? He sort of loses his ability to kind of retain that kind of PR training, and he does get really frustrated about things, kind of like how your grandpa might get frustrated, if you can't find the TV remote, but nonetheless, right? He does sort of get angry. And what was the name of that girl? Something Riley. I should know it. It's awful.
Laken Riley.
Laken Riley. Yes, that's why it's an odd name. But when she was killed, right? His anger was, most basically saying like, why are you bringing this up? Not the anger that, a citizen, someone I'm sworn to protect, has been murdered by an illegal. And
if I might, with a slightly worse example as well, it was after Audrey Hale murdered 3 children and 3 staff members at Covenant High School in Tennessee. He and his administration came out and declared transgender Americans the backbone of the country, which and therefore thereby endorsing, at least tacitly, all of the trans activist protesters occupying state capitals in what I assume must have been the worst thing since 9/11, raising 7 fingers, implying that the murderer Hale herself was some kind of victim of a trans genocide. So this regime, you're right in that the regime always defers to points of shared values or anti-extremism or our liberal democracy, as Biden and Sunak both say, to skin suit traditions in order to whack down dissent from the native law-abiding Christian population on behalf of the intersectional clientele class who actually hate and want to fundamentally transform the country by force.
Well, exactly. And the Covington or the Presbyterian school shooting, I think, is probably the most specific example of that, right? Is that that story becomes no longer about the actual kind of like, anti-white, anti-Christian hate crime, right? It becomes about, they won't let transgender people speak in state legislature. And, like many things, there are any number of times at which people have basically said like, all right, like I'm done with these people. And, I think that to me, I sort of had that moment, during the Trump years with Kavanaugh, and then, sorry, I messed it up, the Covington Catholic kids, right? That Nick Sandvin, right, who was just sort of standing there smiling. And in each case, right, the regime sort of conspired to ruin these men. But after that, and then recently as well, Transgender Day of Visibility was held on Easter Sunday, where it's like, all right, like it is very clear that this is not merely, as kind of was the case in the fake politics of the post-war consensus. Two parties who, don't agree on taxes and don't agree on social spending, but we ultimately all want the same thing. We don't. These people have made very clear who their master is. They've made very clear what their priorities are. And well, I think one thing there's to be said, they will get their reward, in this life or the next. But all the same, it is very clear why politics doesn't work. This is not something that you can simply compromise on. And I think that we see this in the Church of England or in sort of the mainline Protestant denominations in the U.S. that when you let this in, when you sign one part of yourself away, they're coming for all of it, and they will wear your organization like a skin suit. So Connor, we are fast approaching time. I really enjoyed this conversation. I did not realize we had gone as long as we did, but if people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
They can go over to lotuscaesars.com, and every Wednesday at 3 p.m. UK time, I host Tomlinson Talks, which is a show which often involves me monologuing about the issues going on in UK politics and sometimes in international context, and usually interviewing various guests, such as Oren McIntyre or Jeff Younger, or hopefully some politicians in the future. Got that being booked. They can also see me on the podcast Lotus Eaters, which is 1 p.m. UK time every weekday. We've got a rotating group of hosts, but I am frequently on there at least once a week. And then if they follow me on X at @con_Tomlinson, they can see my clips from UK media like GB News or Talk TV, or my columns in The Critic or European Conservative.
Well, again, I highly recommend that. I will have some of those linked in the description. As far as my stuff, you can find me on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I have a Substack that's linked as well. And if you want to support us more directly, you can do that by checking out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Stay tuned. We have a new new whole system for that coming up soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And again, Connor, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, my friend. Appreciate it.
And to everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.